All right, good morning, everyone. Zoom, you hear me all right? Excellent. All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar. To thank Stephen Terizin for dedicating all of his Shuman Drushos this month. Excuse me, in memory of Terry's father, Dr. Harry Khan, Tzvi Hirsch Ben Yosef HaKohen. To thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Shuman Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Zechariah Ben Zechariah and Dina Bas Pesach. Excuse me. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Moshe David and Chana Artman, for dedicating all the Shuman Drushos this month, commission of the 23rd yard site of Moshe David's father, Fishel Beryl Ben Yitzchak Gershon, and to thank Ron Gartenhouse for the dedicating the Week of Learning, the exclusive of Refuah Shlema for his father-in-law, Natan Ben Rivka. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Jack and Betty Gladstein, in memory of Stephen Gladstein, Yisrael Chaim Ben Menachem Mendel Halevi. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamas will have an Aliyah, the families in Nechama, and all those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Well, with that, let us begin. My apologies for the bit of the delayed start this morning. Today's daf is Mem Vav 46, and we are picking up Emeretz Hashem on Mem Ham and Beis 45b at the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah as follows. So also remember again, we are continuing in the process, ultimately, of the ending sacrificial rites, or the concluding sacrificial rites of the Nazir, specifically now focusing on the Nazir Bitara. So the Mishnah says as follows: O Shalkan. So if a person, also remember again, if you're a Nazir Bitara, you're bringing 3 karbanos, a chatos, a shlamim, and an ola. According to at least one of the opinions that we saw in the previous Mishnah, halacha lemaisa, you were going ahead and shechting the shlamim first. So the Mishnah says as follows: So if the Yisrael was cooking the shlamim, o shulkan, Rabbi says shulkan means literally overcooking it. In other words, what the Mishnah is telling me is, you could prepare the shlamim however you want to prepare the shlamim. One thing has to happen: the shlamim has to be cooked in a pot over a fire in the Lishkas HaNazirim, in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. Remember again, this is the southeast corner of the Beis HaMikdash, one of the chambers there called Lishkas HaNazirim. So you could cook it, you could overcook it, but it's got to go in a pot on top of a fire. No, I think you would die from the Mishnah, that the Mishnah wants you to eat meat well done, and people who eat rare meat, it's a meat of Esav. But again, that's just my own opinion. So the Gemara goes right there. So what happens? So the Gemara says, HaKohen notal says Rabbi Shela. So the Kohen goes ahead and the Kohen consumes. Rabbi says Zroa b'Shela means the cooked foreleg. The cooked foreleg. So remember again, this is the portion of the Kohen. Mina ayil, from the ram. L'chala matzah achas min hasan. Rabbi say we haven't spoken about this yet. We'll see this in the Rambam a little bit as well. Part of the concluding rites of the Nazir are also a whole number of loaves. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. What is that? You got this on sale? What happened over here? Menachem, thank you very much. So the Kohen would go ahead. The Kohen would go ahead and cook and take the cooked foreleg. Min ayil v'chala matzah achos. We'll say he would take 1 unleavened loaf min asal from the basket, v'rakik matzah achos, and ultimately what we call one matzah wafer. V'nosin al kape hanazir. And we'll say he would take these loaves and he would go ahead and place it on the palms of the Nazir. Right, so the Nazir would outstretch his hands. The Kohen would put these items on the hands of the Nazir, umanifan, and ultimately, again, the Nazir would wave them. And I'll say, after these concluding rites, so the Nazir, essentially all of the restrictions of Nazirus are lifted, and the Nazir is permitted to drink wine and to become Tameh Tamesim. Those are the concluding rites of the Nazir. Incredible. We'll say, top of Memvav, Rabbi Shimon says, Kevan shenizrak alav echa min hadamim Choter hanazir lishtos biyayin uli tamil mesim. So both say, so we're coming now to a very interesting machlokes. According to the Tanna Kama, the restrictions of Nazirus are only lifted after the Nazir has gone through all of the concluding rituals and rites of his, in other words, of the karbanos. So, right, you have the hair cutting, you have the offering of the karbanos, you have the sprinkling of the blood, you have a whole variety of different things that are occurring. After all of that is done, the restrictions are lifted. Specifically, also, it's even, we're going to see what's unique in the Gemara, is even what we call the tenufa. Tenufa means the waving, right? So we saw in the Mishnah that the Kohen is placing a variety of things on the hands of the Nazir. The Nazir is going to wave it around. According to the Tanna Kama, ultimately the restrictions of Nazirus are only lifted once everything is done. Rabbi Shimon comes along and says, no. As soon as the zrika of one of the karbanos is done, we're done. We're done, right? In other words, we'll say, so you do zrika, remember there are three karbanos, chatas, ola, and shlamim. As soon as you do zrika for one of those karbanos, ultimately, again, the restrictions are lifted. Beautiful. So I'll say, let's analyze this in the Gemara. Says Gemara, Tanrabanan, va'achar yishteh hanazir yayin. So I'll say, here's what's interesting. So the pasuk says as follows. The pasuk reads, the pasuk is talking about the tenufa, the waving of the various items. So it says, v'heinif osam hakohen tenufa lifnei Hashem, kol b'shul hakohen, al chazeh tenufa, v'hazok hatruma, v'achar yishteh hayayin. So the pasuk says, afterwards, the Nazir will drink wine. So I will say, says the Gemara, v'achar yishteh Nazir yayin, achar hamaysim kolim to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, what's achar? After what will the Nazir drink wine? After all of the concluding rituals and rites. That's the position of Rabbi Eliezer, which I will say is the position of the Tanna Kama in the Mishnah. And I will say, by the way, it actually reads very beautifully in the Mishnah, because the Mishnah is actually talking about tenufa. Tenufa is the waving, which we just read in the Mishnah, is the concluding rite, right? It's the last thing that's done. And therefore the pasuk says, va'achar. After you do all of these things, the Nazir becomes, the restrictions of Nazirus are lifted. So that's Rabbi Eliezer in accordance with the Tanna Kama. The Chachamim say, achar maaseh yechidi. The Chachamim say, no, all you need is one act. In other words, as soon as you have one act, really it's one act of significance, from the concluding rituals and rites, the restrictions of Nazirus are lifted. So I will say, what's an example of one act of the concluding rituals and rites? Even zrika of one of the karbanos. Zrika of one of the karbanos. Because if you think about it, that's one of the first things that's done. Because remember, the first thing the Nazir is doing in his concluding ritual and rites is shechting the karbanos. Obviously, shechita of a karban itself is not significant. It's significant, but lamaisa, you can remember what affects acceptance of karbanos. What affects zrika? So according to Rabbi, so the Chum say, as soon as you do zrika, right? As soon as you do one thing, as soon as you just do one act of zrika, ultimately, again, all of the restrictions are lifted. So we'll say the Chachamim hold like Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah. Excuse me. We'll say if we take a look, by the way, at Rashi, Rashi says over something very interesting. Second line, the Chacham achar maaseh yechidi, achar karban, v'afal gav shadayin lo gilach dekarlachas lo ma'akva. Now, the Chiddush over here, according to the Chachamim, is one act, even zrika, which means even that the Nazir hasn't cut his hair. He hasn't even cut his hair yet. Once you've done zrika from one of the karbanos, ultimately the restrictions are lifted. So we'll say, let's analyze. So we'll say, what is the logic of the Rabbanan? So it's interesting, remember, the Gemara doesn't ask, what is the logic of Rabbi Eliezer? Why not? Why not? Because the pasuk really seems to support him, right? The Torah speaks about tenufa, right, which is like the last thing the Nazir does. And then it says, va'achar yishteh hanazir yayin, which really seems to indicate that halacha l'maisa is only after the Nazir does everything that ultimately he's permitted to go ahead and the restrictions are lifted. So the Gemara asks, but what is the logic of the Rabbanan? So ksiv hacha va'achar yishteh hanazir yayin, it says over here, right in the pasuk we just quoted above, which is the pasuk about the concluding rituals and rites of the Nazir. After the Nazir does this, he'll drink wine. Uksiv hasam, and I will say, it says over there, literally again, Achar hiskalcho es nizro. So Rabbi say uses the same notion of achar. It says after he goes ahead and he does his shaving, right? He cuts off his hair. Ma hasam achar ma'isi yechidi. Rabbi say just like achar in the second pasuk quoted is referring. What does achar mean? After how many acts? One act. It's referring after to the act of hair cutting. Afkan. Achar ma'isi yechidi. This is such a fascinating Gzeir Shava. So too when the pasuk says Achar yishta Nazir yayin, what does Achar mean? Achar doesn't have to mean after everything. Rather, what does Achar mean? After one thing. One thing. And therefore when it says Va'achar yishta Nazir yayin, what it means is after the Nazir does one thing, one concluding ritual or rite. Ultimately, again, even Zrika, he's permitted to go ahead and drink wine and become Tamil Mason. Incredible. One second, maybe it means at least two things. In other words, ultimately, again, if you look at Rashi says the ma hasam amar taglachas to the siv achar hiskalcho av kanami achar hiskalcho. So we'll say maybe ultimately again, maybe it still requires at least taglachas. In other words, maybe over here by achar yishtan nazir yayin, maybe it means he needs hair cutting and one other thing. In other words, at least two things. To which the Gemara says, "Ihachi gzeir shava lamli." It will say if that would be true, then the gzeir shava doesn't really do anything. The whole kunz of the gzeir shava ultimately is what? The kunz of the gzeir shava is achar, just like achar in the second pasuk means one thing. So to achar in the first pasuk quoted, achar yishta hanazir yayin also refers to one thing. So I will say, so we end up having a fundamental machlokes. Menachem, thank you again for the water. We end up having a fundamental machlokes over here between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim about at what point in time are the restrictions of Naziros lifted. So ultimately, Rabbi Eliezer is saying Va'achar yishtai nazir yayin only after all the concluding rituals and rites. Chachamim even after one event, one zriga. And Rabbi say this aligns with the machlokes in Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer holds like our Tanakama, and the Chachamim hold like Rabbi Shimon. Beautiful. So Rabbi say let's analyze a bit more. Amarav, Tenufa benazir ma'akeva. So Rav says the waving, the procedure for waving, ultimately again is ma'akev. We'll say now again, what does it mean it's ma'akev? That until the Nazir does the waving, what's the halacha? He's still bound by the restrictions of Nazirus. So the Gemara says as follows. So Aliba de man. So we'll say, whose opinion is this according to? Ilem Aliba Drabanan. So we'll say, if it's Drabanan, now we'll say, remember again, this Drabanan means the Chachamim that we just quoted. So the Rabbanan themselves, Taglachas, Amir Rabbanan lo ma'akva, Tenufa mi boy. So we'll say, the Rabbanan say that even hair cutting is not ma'akiv. Right? Because we'll say, remember again, according to the Rabbanan, at what point in time are the restrictions lifted? At what point in time? As soon as you do one thing, even Zrika. So we'll say, in other words, if hair cutting is not going to be ma'akiv, then what? Then certainly Tenufa is not going to be ma'akiv. Ella aliba, we'll say, last two wide lines, mem vav amad aleph. Ella aliba, to Rabbi Eliezer. Rather, it must be according to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi will say, if that's the case, pshita, that's obvious. Ha'amar Rabbi Eliezer achar maisim kulam. So I'll say, remember again, Rabbi Eliezer is on the record. What does Rabbi Eliezer hold? Rabbi Eliezer holds you need everything. Achar means everything. So I'll say, so I'll tell you something interesting. The Gemara says, Ma'od tema. No, because what would you have thought? You would have thought, Kevan dele'inyan kapara shiare mitzvahi. So I will say, this is very interesting. In general, when you find tenufa, whenever you have a waving obligation, so I will say tenuva, that's the dairy factory, tenufa, right? Tenufa, ultimately, I will say, is never a necessary component for kapara. In general, whenever you find tenufa, it's important. It's obviously part of the concluding rituals and rites, but lamaisa, it's never ma'akev in kapara. So therefore, again, I would have thought, kevan de le'inyan kapara shiari mitzvahi, since when it comes to kapara, both say it's considered to be secondary, ancillary, right? Shiari mitzvah, meaning it's a secondary part of the mitzvah, hachin nami lo ta'akev. I would have thought that even according to Rabbi Eliezer, halacha lamaisa, again, it shouldn't be ma'akev, and therefore the restrictions of Naziros should be lifted even before the Nazir does tenufa. Kamash no. Kamash Malon, when Rabbi Eliezer says, Achar yishtaha Nazir yayin, what does achar mean? Achar means after all of the rituals and rites, including what? Including what? Including tenufa. Now, I will say, before you turn the page, take a quick look at the rush. So I will say, it's the last rush on the daf, left-hand column. Kevan de le'inyan kapar shirei mitzvahi, kedei separ kama dezvachim, shemasa letenufa shiyarei mitzvah, perish shalasa klal, ma'alo alav akosov ki'ilu lo kiber, the keeper, perish kilo lo keeper, shlo asa mitzvah muvchar. The keeper she'ena ma'akva, she'ena ma'akva. So I will say, in general, the Rush points out over here, whenever you find tenufa, I will say, is one of those things where if you did it, great, it's a mitzvah muvchar. And if you didn't do it, you're still yotze. So one might have thought that according to Rabbi Eliezer, that same dynamic applies over here by Nazir. Kamash Malon, that Nazirus is going to be different. Since by Nazirus the pasuk reads Va'achar yishta hanazir yayin, and achar means what? Achar means what according to Eliezer? What does achar mean? After everything, it comes to include even tenufa in the everything. Incredible. Now I'll say Amud Beis, Umi ma'akva. Now I'll say, so where we're holding right now is Rabbi Eliezer holds that in order for the restrictions of Nazirus to be lifted, literally the Nazir has to go ahead. The Nazir has to go ahead and do everything, right? And do everything. So we'll say, so is it loud enough? Okay, thank you. So we'll say, so if at the end of the day, thank you. So we'll say, so if halacha l'maisa now, we're saying that achra means after everything, even tenufa. So we're saying by Nazir, tenufa is ma'akev. So says the Gemara, is that true? Mi ma'akva is tenufa ma'akev by Nazir. We learned, listen to this. Now this is very interesting. Zos Toras HaNazir. This is the halacha of the Nazir. Now this pasuk is the same pasuk we quoted before. I'm sorry. Asher yidar kavan ala Hashem al mizrom milvan asher tasek kafi nidra asher yidar kain. Fine. Zos Toras HaNazir. Bein sheyesh lo kapayim, bein she'ein lo kapayim. Now watch this. What happens if you have a Nazir who doesn't have hands? Now if you don't have hands, what can't you do? Can't do tenufa. So the Torah says, the Brisa says over here, this is the law of the Nazir, whether he has hands or doesn't have hands. So I will say, so which seems to indicate to us that again, if you said that tenufa was ma'akev, then I will say, what should be the halacha? If the Nazir doesn't have hands, then what? Then there's no way for him to go ahead and conclude his Nazirus. And I will say, if you take a quick look at the rush again, it's in the right-hand column, first rush on the daf. Umi ma'akva v'atanya zos toras hanazir ben sheyesh lo kapayim ben she'en lo kapayim v'kasaka daitcha dahachi perusho kemo she'en lo kapayim de'eno menif kain nami sheyesh lo kapayim ein tenufa ma'akeves. So I will say, if you can go ahead and halacha l'maisa conclude your naziros without hands, then I will say, what does that tell you? That tenufa is not ma'akev. Right, that tenufa is not ma'akev. So the Gemara says, so this seems to indicate to us that even according to Rabbi Eliezer, tenufa is not ma'akev. Ve'alaha d'sanyas. We'll say, look at the following brisa. Zos toras hanazir ben sheyesh lo se'ar ben she'en lo se'ar. Wow. Now, so we're going to get into this. What do you do with a bald Nazir? A bald Nazir, right? So again, remember, part of the concluding rituals and rites is head shaving. So what do you do if the Nazir is bald, right? And therefore, halacha l'maisa, there's nothing to shave. So the Brisa says over here, Zos Toras HaNazir, Kodashins the pasuk. This is the law of the Nazir. Again, ben sheyesh lo se'ar, ben she'en lo se'ar. So we'll say whether he has hair, whether it doesn't have hair. Now we'll say, now what does this mean? Would you infer from here that hair cutting is not ma'akev? So we'll say, the Gemara says, Hachanami delo ma'akva. Do you want to suggest over here that hair cutting is not ma'akev? So that's certainly not true. Vatanya we learned. Nazir Mamurat. We'll say, so Nazir Mamurat is the case of a bald Nazir. We're going to talk about this. So Nazir Mamurat. So I'll say, what do you do with a bald Nazir? So Beshame Omrim Eno Sarach Lahavir Ta'arosho. So Beshame says, look, the guy's bald. Leave him alone. Right? In other words, that when you're not going to take a razor over his head because there's nothing to cut. Or Beis Hillel says, Tzarech lahavir ta'ar al rosho. Beis Hillel, on the other hand, hold that no, there's an obligation to go ahead and pass a razor over his head. Well, Ravina. So Ravina said, let's analyze this. My eno tzarech leBeis Shammai. I will say, what does it mean when Beis Shammai says you don't have to pass a razor over his head? Ein lo takana. What it means according to Beis Shammai is when Beis Shammai says you don't have to, Beis Shammai says there's nothing to do for this guy. There is no way, it's actually fascinating, there is no way for him to conclude his Nazirus. Why is there no way for him to conclude his Nazirus? Because I will say part of the way to conclude the Nazirus is hair shaving. If he doesn't have hair, he's locked into his status. L'Beis Hillel, yesh lo takana. But according to Beis Hillel, ultimately, again, he would have a remedy. You both say, what would you do according to Beis Hillel? What would you do according to Beis Hillel? Right? You go ahead and you shave. You just take the razor over his head. Well, according to Beis Hillel, whether there is hair or there is not hair, part of the concluding ritual and rite for the Nazir is taking a razor to his head. And even if he's bald, you would still go ahead and do this process. So we'll say, let's analyze this. So we'll say, so just to kind of bear in mind where we're holding over here. We were just suggesting that according to Machlokas Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, Rabbi Eliezer holds that halacha l'maisa va'achar yishtan nazir yayin. Achar means what? After everything. After everything, like the Tanakama in our Mishnah. Then we have the opinion of the Chacham. The Chacham say achar means what? After one thing. Even zrika. That was like Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah. The chiddush of the Gemara seems to be right now that the Gemara is suggesting that according to Rabbi Eliezer, even tenufa would be necessary. The chiddush in that is that normally tenufas not ma'akev. Now I will say, interesting, but here the Gemara is going to suggest that tenufa is ma'akev according to Rabbi Eliezer. The Gemara challenged that by saying, but 1 second, what happens if you have a Nazir that doesn't have hands? So I will say, what do you do with a Nazir that doesn't have hands? You end his neds in his ear, so that's tenufa. See over here, that tenufa is not ma'akev. Why? Because it says zos tras Nazir. So we'll say the Gemara was just bringing now the same challenge from hair cutting. So the Gemara is going to suggest over here, what happens if you have a bald Nazir? So if you have a bald Nazir, so the Gemara darshin, ben she'ein lo ser, ben she'yesh lo ser. So you have to tell me now that if you can conclude, let's say according to Beis Hillel, who says that you can go ahead and conclude the Ned Nazirus for a bald Nazir. Is that to say that hair cutting is not ma'akev? Certainly not. So we'll say lishnachrina, an alternate version of this. No, sorry, I skipped. V'haimid Rabbi Pedas. I will say, and this discussion that we are having over here, halacha l'maisa is similar ultimately again to Rabbi Pedas. I will say, before we go on, just take a quick look at Rashi. Take a quick look at take a quick look at Rashi. It's almost right across. Ein lo takana. So we'll say, right now where we're holding is the Gemara suggesting that according to Beis Shammai, a bald Nazir is stuck. He's stuck, right? Because again, there's no ability for him to do hair cutting. So take a look at Rashi. Ein lo takana. Hoil ve'in yecholun l'kayim bo mitzas giluach. So according to Beis Shammai, since he is unable to perform the concluding mitzvah of hair cutting, therefore he's stuck in his Naziros. Aval Beis Hillel da'amrit tzarech l'dido yesh lo takana ba'avaras tar ba'alma v'af api she'ein sham se'er she'em megalech imenu. So according to the version we have right now, a bald Nazir, Beis Shammai says you're stuck. Beis Beis Hillel says take the razor, pass it over his head, whatever. You do what you do. Fine. So we'll say this is the position of Rabbi Pedas. What does Rabbi Pedas say? Listen to this. Rabbi Pedas, Beis Shammai v'Rabbi Eliezer amru davar echad. So we'll say Rabbi Pedas says that Beis Shammai. And remember, that's Beis Shammai by the bald Nazir. What does Beis Shammai hold by a bald Nazir? What is it by a bald Nazir? You're stuck. Which Rabbi say, so just so you understand, just like to kind of expound on that a little bit. When Beis Shammai says you're stuck, Beis Shammai says hair cutting is an indispensable part of the process. So therefore, if you don't have hair to cut, you cannot lift the restrictions of your Nazirus. So you're stuck. I'm sorry? No, remember. So this is going with. So obviously, Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Eliezer, right, and like the Tana Kama in the Mishnah, namely that for the concluding rites of Naziros, you need everything. That's one possibility. By the way, we'll see. Second possibility is maybe you don't need everything, but there are certain things which are indispensable needs, like haircutting. In other words, we'll say, and Menachem is raising an important point here. Right now, in the spectrum of opinions we have like one school of thought, which is the Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer, who say that you need everything in order to lift the restrictions of Nazirus. On the other hand, you have, and I keep on forgetting who it is, you have Rabbi Shimon and the Chacham, and Rabbi Shimon and the Chacham, who say on the other hand that what? You only need one thing. We're going to see that there's a middle ground. What's the middle ground? You don't need everything, but what? You need certain things. You need certain things. And those certain things will be more than just any one thing. So a good example that's supposed to say is going to be haircutting. We're going to see that there's a school of thought that says, you're right, I don't need everything, but you absolutely need haircutting, right? You absolutely need haircutting. So we'll see again, that's kind of where we're going in this. Very exciting. So listen to this. So we'll say, Rabbi Pidas, what does Rabbi Pidas say? Because Rabbi Pidas holds, Beis Shammai and Rabbi Eliezer amru davar echad. Beis Shammai and Rabbi Eliezer are of one school of thought. So Gemara says, my Rabbi Eliezer. What Rabbi Eliezer are you referencing over here? So the Sanya, so we'll say, is actually very interesting. We're switching gears now to Metzora. So we'll say, so remember again, by Metzora, what happens by the concluding rituals and rites of the Metzora? There's blood applications. Where is that blood applications? On the big toe, earlobe, right thumb. So watch this. Ein lo bohen yad vrega, on thumb. We'll say, let's say the Metzora is missing his right thumb and his right big toe. Right thumb and right big toe. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Ein lo tara olam estivrei Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, you're stuck. You're stuck. You cannot go ahead and get out of your tumas tsaras because you are missing the necessary components for proper blood application. And we'll say, by the way, even before we go on, this is Beis Shammai. Right, this is Beis Shammai. You're a bald Nazir. And we'll say, what? So what's your status? You're a Nazir, right? You are a grow some hair, buddy, right? You are a Nazir. That's it. You're stuck. So we'll say, Rabbi Shimon says, no. Yanichenu al makomo v'yetze. So we'll say, this is actually Rabbi Eliezer says. Sorry, Rabbi Shimon says, what you do is you place the blood where the thumb or the big toe would have been. Right, so on that part of the body where it would have been, that's where you place it, and you're Yotzei. So we'll say, this Chacham sounds a lot like who? Sounds a lot like Beis Hillel. Then what does a bald Nazir do? What does a bald Nazir do? Shave your head. So Lishnach, in an alternate version, Sefer will say, Rabbi Pidas says that Beis Shammai and Rabbi Eliezer, they're on the same page. Right? Beis Shammai, who says that a bald Nazir can never leave his Nazirus, is on the same page as Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that a Metzora without a big toe, a right big toe, and a right thumb, ultimately again cannot leave their tumah. So Lishnach, we need an alternate version of this. Amar Allah. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you. The Chum say Yaniach al small v'yetze. Very interesting. The Chum say put it on the left. In other words, do the blood application on the left big toe and the left thumb. So three schools of thought, and it's fascinating. Lishnach, we'll say an alternate version of this. Lishnach, Amar La, Amarav, Tenufa benazir ma'akeva. So we'll say an alternate version of our previous discussion. Rav said, Tenufa by a Nazir is ma'akev. So we're now going back. We're going back for just a second. Right? Rav says that Tenufa, the waving rite and rituals by a Nazir are ma'akev. Okay. So the Gemara says, Aliba diman. So we'll say, whose opinion does that reflect? Ilema aliba the Rabbi Eliezer pshita. So we'll say, if it's Rabbi Eliezer, again, that's obvious. We'll say, why is it obvious? Rabbi Eliezer says what? Achar yishtan nazir yayin means what? Achar means what? After everything. Ham Rabbi Eliezer, achar maisim kulam. Rabbi Eliezer says, after everything. Ella aliba de Rabbanon. Rather, Rabbi say, must be according to the Rabbanon, that the Rabbanon require tenufa. Gemara says, what? Hashta yesh lomar taglachas ami Rabbanon lo ma'akva. Tenufa mi boy. Rabbi say, it's possible, remember again, What was the position of the Rabbanon? What was the position of the Rabbanon? The position of the Rabbanon was like Rabbi how do I keep on forgetting who this is? Like Rabbi Shimon, like Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah, right? Who said that what? All you need is what? One thing. So according to the Rabbanon, it's possible that even hair cutting is not ma'akev. So hair cutting is not going to be ma'akev, but tenufa is ma'akev. And I say just understand what a preposterous statement that is. Why? Because in general, what did we say? What's the general status of tenufa by karbanos? It's what we call shiyare mitzvah. Shiyare mitzvah, right? In other words, it's always a secondary or just ancillary piece. So the Rabbanan are going to say that hair cutting is not ma'akev, but tenufa is ma'akev, to which the Gemara, so taglachas, amri Rabbanan lo ma'akva, tenufa mi boy, umi lo ma'akva. So I'll say, is that true? Is that true ultimately, again, that hair cutting is not ma'akev? So let's analyze this. Tanya, we learned, Zos Toras HaNazir. This is the Torah of the Nazir. Remember again, all this is right now is, remember, is Lishna Achrina. So this is a little bit of a different slant on the exact conversation we just had before. So watch this. We learned Zos Toras HaNazir. This is the rule of the Nazir. Whether the Nazir has hands or doesn't have hands. What does that teach us? Say if you can do tenufa, great. And if you can't do tenufa, move on, fine, can't do tenufa. First of all, take a quick look. Take a quick look at the rush. Okay, so this is in the middle. I hope we have somewhat similar pagination with this. So say if you look, the rush has three sets of lines. There are the short lines, the middle wide lines, and the widest or longest lines. In the middle, no, not at all, not even remotely. Okay. All right. It's Rosh Divrei Maskal Vasanya Zos Toras HaNazir. It's second longest line. Perfect. Excellent. Thank you. Vasanya Zos Toras HaNazir. Usvirale Tahachi Perusha Kishim Shebe'ein Lokapayim Dinhu Shema Akev Dichol She'in Roy Bila Bila Makeves Hachanai Biyeshlo Makeves Vekasaka Naitra Da Al Karkach Lo Lav Kribeliezer the Imkain Lishtok Kra Mizos Torah the Seifukle Me'achar Kalamaisim El Lav Rabbanon Ubetnufa Modu Dima Akva. So we'll say it must be that ultimately again by Tenufa. If the Rabbanon are going to be modeh, that tenufa is ma'akev, the Rabbanon say al achas kama v'kama, taglachas is going to be ma'akev. So Gemara, I'm sorry, back to the Gemara. Elahod d'sanya, zos Toras HaNazir. This is the Torah of the Nazir. Bein sheyesh lo se'ar, bein she'en lo se'ar. Whether the Nazir has hair, the Nazir doesn't have hair. The Gemara says hachanami dima'akva. So too it should be ma'akev over here as well. Vatanya, but we learned Nazir memurat. Bald Nazir. Beis Shammai omrim eino tzarich lahavir ta'arosho. Beis Shammai says a bald Nazir doesn't have to do anything. Beis Hillel omrim tzarich. Beis Hillel says no, he has to take the razor over his head. And the Gemara says Amar Rabbi Avina might tzarich leBeis Hillel. What does it mean? Beis Hillel says tzarich, that you have to take the razor over the head. So the Gemara says tzarich ve'ein lo takana. So I'll say this is a Lishna Achrina. In this version, when it says that Beis Hillel has that the bald Nazir, according to Beis Hillel, has to take the razor on his head, what Beis Hillel means is what? He has to, but what? But he can't. Why can't he? Because he's bald. So the Gemara says, LeBeis Shammai yesh lo takana. According to Beis Shammai, however, ultimately again, he would have a takana. What's the takana ultimately again? The takana would be lemaisi. He shaves whatever. He takes the razor to his head. And the Gemara says this version upliga the Rabbi Pedas. Rabbi say this version ultimately goes ahead and argues on Rabbi Pedas. So Rabbi say the fundamental distinction between lishna kam lishna achrina is the positions of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. In the first version, with the bald Nazir, Beis Hillel is saying that halacha lemaisa, taglachas is not, or taglachas is ma'akev. You have to do taglachas, but a bald Nazir just takes the razor over his head and that's it. According to Beis Shammai, you're locked out. You can't do the concluding ritual of shaving the head, and therefore halacha lemaisa, you remain a Nazir forever. According to the second version, Beis Hillel is the one who says there's no recourse for this guy, and Beis Shammai says there is. Let him just take a razor to his head. So Rabbi says, so how do we paskin with all of this? So what I want to do is as follows. I want to spend just a few minutes on the Rambam from yesterday's sugya and from today's sugya, because this will actually round out the halacha l'maisa with the concluding rituals and rites. So both say, I want to go a little bit out of order. Let's start with today's sugya first. This is all, just to give you the Maramakom, this is all in the Rambam, Hilchos Nazirus, Parak Ches, it's actually halachos Aleph through Zayin. It's yesterday and today's daf, all in condensed form. So we'll say, let's go out of order. I'm going to start with halacha Hey. Nazir Memurat, because I will say, is this not the most intriguing case we have? A bald Nazir. A bald Nazir. It's so fascinating to think, because remember, again, when we think Nazirus, we think hair. When we think conclusion of Nazirus, we think haircut, right? Shaving. So I'll say, so what is that? So listen to this. Rambam says, Nazir Memorat, a bald Nazir. Get ready, right? Eino sarech lahavir tar. Ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, he does not have to pass a razor over his head. Afa pi she'en lo se'ar, o she'en lo kapayim, harei makriv karbonosa v'yishta v'yitameh. So we'll say, ultimately, again, the Rambam paskins, halacha l'maisa, that if you don't have hair, there's no hair cutting. Just like if you don't have hands, there's no tenufa. There's no tenufa. And the Rambam says, so what do you do in this situation? You do the other parts of the concluding rituals and rites, and your neder naziros is done. V'mhevi karbonosav v'lo gilach rosho in taglachas ma'akeves elashos metame ler. We'll say not only that, but the Rambam paskins, that halacha l'maisa, once you bring your karbanos, ultimately, again, the restrictions of Naziros are lifted. Rabbi say we're actually going to see. So the Rambam is going to paskin also. The Rambam is going to paskin. We're going to see halacha l'maisa, like the Chachamim, namely achar maisi yechidi. So let me bring this together for just a moment. So the way the Rambam paskins is, once you do something, right, in the concluding ritual and rite. So the way the Rambam phrases it is, v'mhevi karbonosav. Once you bring your karbanos, even though you have not yet done the hair cutting, the restrictions of Naziros are lifted. Right? So we'll say, so two very important pieces of halacha l'maisa, right? Number one, so if bald Nazir, nothing to do. Right, nothing to do. Right, you don't know something to do. I mean, no hair cutting. You don't have to pass the razor over your head. Right, Nazir doesn't have hands. Right, no tenufa. At what point in time are the restrictions of Naziros lifted? Ultimately, again, the Rambam's lashon is karbonosav. After you bring your karbanos, ultimately, again, the restrictions are lifted. Now, watch this. Now, 1 second. But what does it mean after you bring your karbanos? Umishayizarek alav echad min hadamim chotar. Mamish like the Chachamim say. All you need, one zrika. So the Rambam paskins like the Chachamim. They will say, after you do the zrika of the first animal, now the pashtas, again, at least according to the majority opinion, the first animal offered is the shlamim. So once you do, or the chatas, machlokes, once you do zrika on the first animal, ultimately, again, the restrictions of Naziros are lifted. Incredible. Chotar avapi shlo nasan al kapov v'lo heinif shekol dvarim elu lemitzvah v'lo la'akev. Shabbos said the Rambam Paskins is like this. The only thing that is absolutely indispensable necessity for the conclusion of Neder Naziros is Zrika. What he calls karbanos, specifically Zrika. Once Zrika is done for one of the karbanos, the Neder Naziros has effectively come to a close. That's the halacha. Bald Nazir, don't have to do anything. Handless Nazir, this is quite a chevah, right? Handless Nazir, right? Don't have to do anything. Again, none of it is ma'akev. All right, so, the Rambam then goes on. He says, however, we'll say one more halacha. He says, Afa pi she'ena taglachas ma'akev. Even though hair cutting is not ma'akev, right? Shabbos says, so even before the Nazir cuts his hair, the restrictions of Naziros are lifted. Mitzvah legaleach afilu la'achar zman meruba. Ultimately, again, there is a mitzvah for him to cut his hair. And Shabbos says, this is very important. In other words, there's a difference between something that is ma'akev and something that's a mitzvah. Something that's ma'akev, Rabbi say, holds you back if you don't do it, right? It's an indispensable part of the process, and if you don't do it, you're stuck in your current reality. So zrika is ma'akev. Hair cutting is not ma'akev, but it's a mitzvah. And because it's a mitzvah, ultimately, again, Ultimately, it should be done even much later. Good. The Rambam goes on with other specifics. I will say, but that is the bottom line halacha lemaisa. I will just point out that the Rambam, one more piece of halacha lemaisa is as follows. In terms of the order, remember again, one of the previous machloksim we had is we know Nazir b'tara brings 3 karbanos: a chatos, an ola, and the shlamim. Remember we had a machlokis, which one goes first? The Rambam paskins v'shochet hachatos tchila. Ultimately, again, halacha lemaisa, the chatos goes first. Right? And the Rambam says, in an ideal world, what you're going to do is you're going to do the chatos, ola, and shlamim, and then afterwards is when you're going to go ahead and take your haircut. But he says, halacha lemaisa, if you did your haircut after the chatos, ultimately, again, you're going to be Yotzi Adal. So I will say, there's more halacha lemaisa from the previous sugya, but I just want to share with you just a short idea in the parsha, which actually ties into the daf very beautifully as well, before in the few remaining moments that we have. Sorry. So I'll say Parshas Kisisa, we read of, again, I mentioned this in the virtual drush as well, it's probably it is the most like traumatic and tragic episode of the entire Torah. Chet Egel, of the golden calf. And the reason, Chazal compare Chet Egel to a kala, right, to a bride who commits adultery underneath her chuppah. In other words, adultery is always a heinous and grievous sin. But to think that the kala is committing adultery right in the moment where the marriage itself is being forged is an overwhelming thing. So Klal Yisrael standing here at Har Sinai with that Kodesh Baruch Hu, they just said Na'aseh v'nishma, right? It's such a moment of spiritual intimacy, spiritual togetherness, and now in a panicked moment, Klal Yisrael resorts to all types of heinous behavior, right? It wasn't just that they built a calf. According to most opinions, the calf was avodah zara. There was also, rampant immorality that was happening around the calf. It was just a fundamental breakdown in every single way. So we know the story. Moshe Rabbeinu comes down, breaks the luchos. But I will say, perhaps the most incredible part of the story is Moshe Rabbeinu's advocacy on behalf of Klal Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu literally, I will say, I want to point out, this is the moment where Moshe Rabbeinu emerges as the true Manig Yisrael. The true manig, who advocates and lobbies on behalf of his people. But if you think about it for just a moment, where did Moshe Rabbeinu get that koach from? Right? To advocate for someone or something, you have to believe in them. To believe in them, you have to see something good. They were like bereft of holiness and bereft of goodness and just had totally. It's just such a horrible moment. So if you're Moshe Rabbeinu, how do you go ahead and advocate for them? So I want to show you something amazing. In yesterday's daf, in the beginning of, and this is incredible how everything ties together, but in yesterday's daf, the top of Mem Hey, if you remember again, the Gemara quoted the pasuk, Vayikach Moshes Atzmos Yosef Imo. Right, the Gemara quoted the pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu took, literally again, the remains of Yosef with him. The remains of Atzmos Yosef. The Megala Amukos says something so beautiful. He says, in addition, what do you mean, Vaikach Moshe Atzmos Yosef Imo? He says, Atzmos means bones, remains. But the Megala Amukos reads is, Vaikach Moshe es Atzmius Yosef Imo. Moshe Rabbeinu took the essence of Yosef, the Atzmius of Yosef, the gestalt of who Yosef was, he took that with him. And the Megala Amukos says, what does that mean? What does that mean? And I will say it's quite beautiful. What was the gadlus of Yosef? Yosef could have very easily been angry and bitter and resentful and vengeful against his brothers. Right? He could have easily said to them, look at what you guys did to me. You robbed me of everything, of my life, of my dignity, of a future. Threw me into a pit, mamish like that. Worse than an animal. Fine, it worked out fine. But Lamaisa, look what you guys did. But instead, what does Yosef do? Yosef chooses at the end of the day to let go of the anger, to let go of the animosity, to let go of the bitterness, and chooses to focus on the positive. Meaning, so Yosef goes in and when confronted by his brothers, or I should say, when his brothers are confronted by him, instead of lashing into them, what he says is, Lo atem shalachani, it wasn't you. it was all parts of the divine plan. What do you mean it wasn't you? Of course it was you. Of course it was you. It's not you guys. Yes, it is you guys. Yosef was blessed with the power of positive perspective. And that power of positive perspective allowed Yosef to see the situation in a panoramic view as opposed to a tunnel view. And in the panoramic view, he realized that he was part of something much bigger. And that positive perspective allowed him to see the totality of life and the Yad Hashem, the hand of God. That power of positive perspective allowed him to see his brothers in a panoramic view, recognizing that although his brothers did something really terrible, that didn't mean that they were terrible people. Because sometimes even really great people do really bad things. But the really bad thing doesn't make me into a really bad person. It just means I'm a good person who struggles with a lot in life. That was the greatness of Yosef. And therefore says the Megala Mukos, when Moshe Rabbeinu is leaving Egypt, ready to assume the mantle of leadership for Klal Yisrael, Vayikach Moshe es atzmos Yosef imo. Moshe takes the atzmos, he takes the essence of Yosef with him. In other words, if you're going to be a man, if you're going to be a leader, you have to see the good. If you're going to go and inspire people, you have to always see the good, the situational good and the personalistic good. You have to be able to see people in their totality. I will say it is so easy to see a person just through the lens of a current failure. Look at what you did. Look at how horrible this is. Or you can see a person in a panoramic view. And I will say, when you look at any person in a panoramic view, what are you going to find? You're going to find some bad, but often what else are you going to find? A lot of good. That was the godless of Yosef. And I will say, because Moshe Rabbeinu possessed the atzmos of Yosef, the atzmius of Yosef, that's why he was able to lobby and advocate on behalf of them, even in this moment of horrific Avera. Because essentially he's able to say, this is not the totality of who they are. This is a doozy. This is a big mistake. But it's not everything. It's not everything. There's so much good. There's so much beauty. There's so much holiness. There's so much goodness. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'm able to see them in totality. You have to do the same. In Chevra, that's our avodah as well. To take the atzmos Yosef, to take the atzmius of Yosef with us as well. We all have relationships. And the key to relationships is seeing people in their totality. The key to maintaining positive perspective in life is seeing life in its totality. Moshe Rabbeinu took atzmos, the atzmius of Yosef, every step of the way with him. We should be zocheh to do the same. Shabbos.